So Super Rugby round 11 Saturday games, 4 games across Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. Some pretty interesting looking matchups. We'll start with the first one, which is the Reds taking on the Lions over in Brisbane. It's an early game over there on Saturday. So you look at this one and my first thought is just the scrum. You don't really look forward, some people do, but I generally don't look forward to that many games just to see how the scrum's going to go. But I'm very keen to see how the scrum goes. The Lions scrum has been pretty strong for this whole comp. The Reds started off with a really dominant scrum, but they seem to have been worked out a bit by the teams. It's not just been kind of an all-dominant performance in the kind of second half of the first half of the season. So the Reds coming in with a almost opposite record of the Lions, so 3 wins, 5 losses, whereas the Lions 6 and 3. Both on kind of opposite runs, with the Reds having accumulated a few losses in a row, and it doesn't get any easier with the Lions coming to town. The Lions have started their tour of Australia well, and will definitely want to put in a performance here before they hop across the ditch and come to New Zealand. For the Reds, speaking of their scrum, Slipper is out, so JP Smith gets his first start in the Reds jersey. Hamish Stewart, the youngster, starts at 10, so that's an interesting one. Another youngster, Jordan Pataya, is on the left wing, and at the other end of the age scale, George Smith starts at the open side. So, Thorny continues his kind of bolstering of the youth ranks of Queensland rugby. You got to think it's an investment in the future, and games like this against the Lions is only going to make these guys better players going forward. So, it's going to be a hard night. There's definitely going to be a few testing moments for them, but we'll see how they go. You never know with young guys, because they've got no kind of inhibitions about some of these things, so that they might just go ahead and surprise us. For the Lions, they're largely unchanged, but Johan Janssen van Rensburg is in at 12, so Harold Forster moves out to 13. The Reds, like I mentioned, the scrum, I thought last week against the Chiefs, who are really down to the bottom of their barrel for props, I thought the Reds might be able to kind of bully them around, but it never ended up happening. So you've got to think that perhaps the dominant side is going to be on the Lions just for this game, because they've been pretty consistently powerful all season. They will definitely need to start sharper than they did last week against the Chiefs. They didn't really show up for the first kind of half an hour, and they were chasing the game from then on, which is hard to do, and it's going to be the same against the Lions. If you give them a lead, it's pretty unlikely you're going to catch them. For the Lions, it's basically trying to stick to their game plan. You've got to think that the Reds are going to do as much as they can to try and disrupt, kind of not let them play that free-flowing game that they like. So as long as their set piece is strong, that'll give them a good platform to build everything else on. So as long as they don't get slowed down too much and don't give into any niggle that kind of arises, then you got to think that the Lions are favourites. The bookies have got the Lions by 12, so comfortable but not outrageous. We'll see how it goes. Second game sees the Blues take on the Jaguares over in Auckland. Two teams on very different runs. Jaguares having built a couple of wins together on their tour of Australia, kind of on the up, looking towards the playoffs. The Blues, pretty horrendous run of losses, are only looking down at the Sunwolves below them and thinking, we don't want to end up there. So you got to think the Blues are pretty beat up and demoralised, and there's got to be motivation there to prove that they're not as bad as their record of 2 wins and 6 losses shows. So this is another opportunity for them. Whereas the Jaguares, they're actually looking to the playoffs. They have to be. They've almost evened out their record, 4 wins, 5 losses. This New Zealand tour could be kind of make or break for them, depending on how other results go. But definitely losing against the Blues is going to hurt because they've played one more game than most of the other teams. So it's pretty important they put in a performance here. They're another team who's suffered a bit from inconsistency. So if they can make it through on the bounce, that will certainly help things. For the Blues, in terms of their injuries, Pulu is back at 9. Or he's bracketed back at 9. So he's probably going to play, but we'll see. Kauli Tuioti is back, but in terms of players out, they also lose TJ Whaiane and Patrick Tuipulotu, who's ill. So kind of get one back, lose another one. Duffy's playing at 15. Rico Ioane moves into 12, and Gatland is not selected at all. For the Jaguares, Pablo Matera is out, which is pretty bad news if you're a Jaguares fan. So Senatore moves into 8 with Ortega Decio moving onto the flank. Landajo starts at 9, and Lavanini is on the bench for this one. For the Blues, I mean, they're second to last. In terms of points, there's probably a slight hope that they can make the playoffs. But if you have a look at their schedule, they've still got to play the Hurricanes twice and the Crusaders once. You can't imagine them picking up many points in those games. So it's pretty much the end of the line for them. And it's just trying about getting some respectability before the season's over. So it's another game at home. It's another chance to do that. They'll be hoping it's just not another repeat of the Sharks' performance. We'll see how the crowd attendance is, because I've mentioned once in a video before that Auckland's got a few sports teams, and the local league team, who is also generally just as bad as the Blues, are actually on a really good run this year, so they're getting far better attendances than the Blues. So you got to think those casual fans are going to be sticking with the winning team, basically. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the stands are pretty empty for this one. For the Jaguares, man, what a win in New Zealand would do for their kind of morale, and just it's always nice to win in a place you haven't won before. So yeah, it just gets that kind of monkey off the back. And yeah, in terms of their playoff race, it'd be massive. So I think I said this in the comments, if I put on my neutral hat, it's much nicer for the Jaguares to win this one, because in terms of their season, it wins a lot more. But in terms of my loyalty to the Blues, of course, I don't want to see them lose again. So I guess either way, I can be kind of satisfied that if the Blues win, it might prop the Jaguares up to the playoffs, but then again, that'd be at the cost of somebody else. So it's all a bit difficult. The bookies have got the Blues by 8. So why by 8? I don't know. It's an awful lot of faith being showed in the Blues by the bookies. So we'll see. We'll see. Third game of the round, third game of the day. We've got the Brumbies taking on the Crusaders over in Canberra. So it's historically been a pretty fierce rivalry over the years, but perhaps not so much in recent years, with it being pretty one-sided. The Brumbies, for them, their job only gets a bit harder. They've been on a poor run, and now the Crusaders are coming into town at a pretty bad time. They're still hurting after their results against the Highlanders and the Jaguares. They haven't been able to get it quite right, and now they've got to face the Crusaders. So if they are going to get it right, they better do it quickly. For the Crusaders, they're still not their full-strength team. They haven't been their full-strength team all season. But they'll just be relying on some of their lesser names to get the job done, as they have been doing all season. Speaking of names, David Pocock's out of this one. I think it's pretty precautionary, because he's not been 100% with his knee, and from what I read, he's played a few games in a row now, and it's time for him to have a rest, to make sure. Good Lord, what's wrong with my throat today? To make sure he doesn't kind of aggravate anything and do any long-term injuries, and he needs a rest. Liliafano is also still being rested because he's been playing in Europe, so they're trying to make sure he doesn't burn out. Cusack starts at 7, and lock Blake Eneva starts at 6. So that'll be an interesting one, whether they're trying to put a bit more pressure on at the line-out. Not sure. For the Crusaders, the injury list is growing, but Sam Whitelock is back. Ben Fennell is one of the ones who's injured, so Cody Taylor gets a start at 2. Hall gets the nod over Drummond at 9, and Taufua and Bedwell Curtis are back on the back row. Mate'ale's on the bench, so Tamani Valu gets a start. Yeah, it's interesting timing with the Brumbies resting Pocock and Liliafano. The cynical part of me says, is this because they think they can't win this one and are targeting later games? I don't know. You know, sometimes teams rest their good players if they're playing a bad team, but likewise, sometimes teams rest their best players if they think a game is either not worth a win, like, you know, you've already qualified for the playoffs, you're not going to make any difference at the end of the season, or if you legitimately think you can't win, you've got some other fixtures coming up that you think are better targets. So it could just be interesting timing that that now is the time that David Pocock needs a rest, and you're resting Liliafano for a second week. I don't know. All I know is if the Brumbies are going to win this one, they're going to have to execute pretty well and go on with a pretty solid game plan to disrupt what the Crusaders do, but much easier said than done. For the Crusaders, it's another week where you've got to go into Australia, pick up points, and not drop behind in the New Zealand Conference. That's it. We'll know the Hurricanes result before this one, so whether they remain top of the New Zealand Conference will depend on their result against the Brumbies, probably. Bonus point will be the target for sure. Bookies have got the Crusaders by 15. So again, pretty comfortable, but not like a 40-point one that the Hurricanes are predicted to beat the Sunwolves by. Last one sees the high-flying Bulls take on the Highlanders. So John Mitchell was talking this game up after last week's Bulls game against the Rebels, where he was very critical of the Rebels for their kind of time management, you know, slowing the game down. He said that this one's going to be a real cracker because the Highlanders kind of like to go for it and like counter-attacking and that kind of thing, that they're not going to muck around. So the Bulls have been on a good run of form, and they've already beaten a New Zealand team at Loftus, so there's every reason for them to be confident going into this one. The Highlanders, they're on tour. It's going to be a big part of how they kind of finish up in the playoffs. You know, where they're ranked is how they perform on this tour. So yeah, there's lots for them to play for as well. For the Bulls, Schoeman is out for a lengthy time. I think 6 weeks it was from memory, for biting in the last game, which is just plain dumb. So Gboka gets the start. Roloff Smith is also out injured. So another lock playing in the back row is Jason Jenkins. So that'll be interesting to see how he goes. Ishmael and Nick Diacha are back on the bench, so that's some good news for the Bulls. For the Highlanders, Lomax starts in the front row because Tokalahi is out. Elliot Dixon starts on the blindside flank. Frizzell's on the bench, and Naholo's being rested. I think he's not been 100% as well. So Ben Smith is on the wing with Fletcher Smith at fullback. So interesting little kind of shuffle around. The Bulls are currently in the playoff spots, which is encouraging for them after last season, and for sure another win over a New Zealand team at home would definitely help kind of put them in a more of a playoff picture, kind of get them out of that just in the playoffs area and move them up. But yeah, we would also just help the crowd attendance for sure. If you can put on some good results at home, the crowds in theory will come. For the Highlanders, they proved last week that they can win away against the Blues after some less than kind of stellar away performances previously against tough teams, admittedly. So they'll need to follow a few other New Zealand teams who've gone into South Africa and get wins. They will not want to do kind of what the Hurricanes did and struggle against what has been a pretty tough Bulls team. So we will see. The bookies have only got the Highlanders by 5, so they're predicting this one to be kind of the tightest of these games. But 3 of the favourites of the 4 are the away teams. So that'll be kind of interesting watching. The only home favourite is the Blues, which is even more interesting. But we'll see how that goes. I'm looking forward to these ones. So yeah, let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments. Who you think's going to get up and win these ones? Whether you think the bookies have got it right or if they're a bit off the mark. And yeah, I'll talk to you again soon.